Mankind has always looked to the stars. Since time immemorial, the universe has been a source of fascination and fundamental questions. What else is out there? How was all this created? Where do we come from? Without rockets, spaceflight would be impossible. Only if it has launch systems of its own can a country or an association of states lift off from the Earth and utilize space as a place of research, but also as an economic realm. Man's advance into space was long seen as a prestige duel between the United States and the Soviet Union, as it then was. But today, Europe also plays a leading role among the space nations. Welcome to Spacetime with astronaut and scientist Ulrich Walter. He knows that in space, incredible things await us. Space is an economic location. Satellites orbiting the Earth form the basis for ever-new business models. Manufacturing satellites and putting them in orbit is a multi-billion-dollar business, for Europe too. With its carrier rockets, the European space enterprise Ariane Space is the world's most successful launch provider for commercial satellites.
We in Europe can be really proud of our Ariane 5. So far, it has chalked up nearly 100 launches, with a reliability of 98%. As a result, we now cover almost 50% of the world market. So we really are in pole position. But our competitors are not sitting idly by. A small American company called SpaceX now builds launch vehicles which cost only half as much as Ariane 5. So how much longer can we maintain pole position?
Europe has arrived in space. ESA, the European Space Agency, operates its own laboratory on the International Space Station and regularly sends astronauts into Earth orbit. The satellite market is booming, and where Earth observation and research into the solar system are concerned, the Europeans play a leading role. Europe is a space power. Even Europeans themselves often don't realize it, but Europe occupies an important position in international spaceflight. At ESA, remote sensing and environmental protection have absolute priority. In developing the Ariane rocket program, Europe has secured its own access to space and emancipated itself from the leading space powers, Russia and the United States.
Europe, as a whole, is relatively autonomous in virtually all areas. If we pool all our strengths and expertise, we will go a long, long way.
Just how visionary and successful European spaceflight can be was shown by the Rosetta mission to the comet Churyumov-Gerasimenko. On board the Rosetta probe was Philae, a lander designed to descend to the comet, a lump of ice and dust hurtling through space. The journey took 10 years, 5 months and 4 days. 3 Earth flybys and 1 Mars flyby gave Rosetta additional speed, enable it to travel far beyond the inner solar system. The probe had covered 6.4 billion kilometers when in August 2014 it reached the comet's orbit with pinpoint accuracy and deployed the Philae lander on its surface. It was an unparalleled achievement. Landing on a comet racing through space was a milestone in the history of the European spaceflight program. However, Philae did not touch down on the comet as gently as was planned, bouncing over its surface several times before finally coming to rest. Rosetta and Philae sent back data and pictures of inestimable value for 2 years, until September 2016, when the Rosetta mission was ended.
We've established ourselves, but can't afford to rest. We must keep going.
Spaceflight requires the courage to pursue visions. Curiosity and the passion for discovery are important characteristics of human nature. Half a century after man first set foot on the moon, Europe too is considering a return to the Earth satellite. Not as a solo effort, however. The aim is for the moon to serve as a base for joint future projects by the space nations. The European Moon Village concept is designed to stimulate global cooperation for deeper research into space.
The Moon Village is not an ESA program. It's not about using taxpayers' money to build houses on the moon. The aim is to forge a partnership that will have resources available because of the interests that are involved, and to establish a kind of research infrastructure based on those interests. That's perhaps not too dissimilar from what the international community is currently doing in the Antarctic, where researchers or those with interests there are setting up stations in order to carry out research and to secure their interests.
The International Space Station is reaching the end of its operational life. A research station on the moon would be a new joint outpost of mankind in space.
Because it offers numerous opportunities for totally diverse people, I believe this Moon Village concept will endure. It will act as a springboard for scientists, engineers, and technologists. And tourism will also be a feature. I'm convinced one day summer holidays on the moon will be on offer.
One thing is certain: if man wants to advance further into space and perhaps set foot on Mars, the moon would be an ideal springboard. Where development of the European launch vehicle Ariane 6 is concerned, the focus is not so much on visions as on lucrative orders in the satellite business. The launcher market is fiercely contested, and Ariane 6 is designed to ensure that Europe remains competitive and has access to space in the future too.
We need Ariane 6 in order to cut our prices. Of course, we want to remain market leader, and we can only achieve this by offering competitive launches. This means lowering our prices. We have no alternative, and that's why we're developing Ariane 6.
The launch vehicle operator was startled by the appearance of a newcomer to the sector from California. The private spaceflight agency SpaceX offers transport into space at far more favorable conditions than the Europeans with their Ariane launchers. Over just a few years in the business, SpaceX has steadily increased its share of the market and is forcing the established providers to rethink.
Ariane 6 is a modern launch system which, first and foremost, enables modern production and management systems to be used. Ariane 5 was based far more on a European division of labor. Above all, it was also heavily focused on manufacturing facilities. With Ariane 6, we are focused on industrial production even more and are trying to establish an optimized overall industrial system geared to general economic conditions.
But with their family of Ariane rockets, it was the Europeans who proved that money can be earned in space. The launcher business was privatized a lot sooner in Europe than in Russia or the United States. And in the Ariane Space joint venture, Europe has a company which has been successfully marketing launch vehicles for many years. Since the first flight on Christmas Eve 1979, Ariane launchers have been securing Europe's access to space. Before then, NASA had a monopoly on sending satellites into space on a commercial basis.
Strangely enough, we have the Americans to thank for the success of the Ariane launches. Back in 1974, the Europeans wanted to build their own commercial new satellite. And they did. It was called Symphony. We then took it to the Americans and said, please launch it into orbit. But they said, no, it will compete with our own new satellites. You may use it only for test purposes. The European response was, no way. In the future, we will need reliable access to space. And that is how the Ariane program came into being.
German physicist Wernher von Braun played a central role in man treading the path into space. During the Second World War, von Braun and his colleagues in Peenemünde on the Baltic Sea were commissioned with the construction of a ballistic missile, the A4. Renamed the V2, meaning Vergeltung, reprisal weapon by Nazi propaganda, it was the world's first functional large rocket. The V2, the miracle weapon, was designed to cause death and destruction deep in enemy territory, but the rocket was unable to change the course of the war. On October 3, 1942, an A4 was fired into space from Peenemünde. The rocket was the first man-made object to fly beyond the Earth's atmosphere. With our rocket, we have reached into space, was the delighted reaction of the head of Germany's missile program, Walter Dornberger. Towards the end of the war, the United States and the Soviet Union secured the expertise of the German specialists. Human reparation and the booty of peace were the terms the victorious powers used to describe the dispatching of experts to Russia or the United States. Wernher von Braun surrendered voluntarily to the Americans. It was a wise decision. Von Braun quickly dominated American rocket research. On the basis of the V2, the German miracle weapon, he developed the United States international rockets with their nuclear warheads, the same rockets with which the first Americans then flew into space. Finally, on the basis of his A4 rocket, he developed the Saturn V, which took man to the moon.
But there's also another story. The head of development in Peenemünde, Helmut Gröttrup, was captured by the Russians and taken to the Soviet Union, where he helped design the R-1, a purely military rocket. From this, the R-7 developed, the mother of all Russian rockets, including the Soyuz rockets, which are still in service today. What's more, the Chinese bought the R-7 technology and used it to develop their own Long March rocket. Thus, A4 rocket technology slowly made its way around the world.
Europe almost missed out on the dawn of the space age. To ensure its own access to space, in the early 60s, the Europeans set up ELDO, the European Launcher Development Organization. On the basis of already existing national projects, the Europeans assembled their own space rocket. Australia was included as a non-European member. It was planned to use a launch site which the British had already established near the South Australian town of Woomera. ELDO built 2 rockets, but neither functioned flawlessly.
In a word, both ELDO rockets were a flop. Why? Because the 4 space nations, Britain, Germany, France, and Italy, failed on the management side. The Germans built the upper stage, starting from scratch. The British had their old Blue Streak rocket and thought, oh, we'll just throw that into the mix. It'll work. Basically, each nation did its own thing, and in the end, nothing worked. As a result, the 2 rockets exploded on liftoff. Naturally, this did not go unnoticed in the countries involved, and they gradually withdrew from ELDO, which was finally ended in 1972. For the Europeans, this was reason to start all over again. In 1975, they founded ESA and did everything in a totally different way.
From then on, the newly established European Space Agency coordinated and controlled the construction of a new carrier rocket. It was the birth of the Ariane program and the beginning of a long success story.
Europe was, of course, somewhat lagging behind as a result of the fiercely contested space race between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. But it can also be said that Europe has made great strides, this time no longer messing around, but always attempting to cooperate with others in the space sector. Naturally, ESA cooperates with NASA, our #1 partner. At the same time, though, we also cooperate with the Russians. We cooperate with the Japanese, with South Africa, with South America, and also with China.
Under the ESA, the Ariane rockets soon set standards in efficiency and reliability. For Europe, reaching out into space meant political sovereignty and a steadily growing economic factor.
Raumfahrt setzt voraus, dass man
To engage in spaceflight, you need rockets.
auf diesem Gebiet
Anyone who's not independent in this field is vulnerable.
ist davon abhängig, dass seine
They require their satellites to be launched by other nations who might not be well disposed toward them.
in das All gebracht werden.
It would be like ordering a spy satellite from the other side out of the question.
Bei der gegnerischen Partei bestellt.
But it is also about commercial utilization.
Das hat aber auch etwas mit
In this respect, anyone who is not able to cover the entire value-added chain in spaceflight is lagging behind.
ist bei der kommerziellen Nutzung hinten dran.
The big money is earned in the classic utilization of Earth orbit, transporting satellites into space, marketing communication satellites, and selling remote sensing data. Satellites provide pictures and information faster and more precisely than ever before.
People in Europe use space products every day, starting with the weather map. Then there's satellite navigation, which plays an important basic role. Only in 10 years' time will we fully realize its usefulness as inspiration for the next generation of discoverers, scientists, engineers, and technologists, and for exploration in the sense of technological innovation.
Das sind Dinge, die sehen wir erst in 10 Jahren.
Europe is still market leader in the satellite business, but real innovations usually come from elsewhere. The American Space Agency, NASA, places most of its business in private hands. It long since opened up its launch site at Cape Canaveral to commercial providers in the space business.
Which space nations have launch sites? And where exactly are they located? Let's start with the Americans. Since the late 50s, their launch sites have traditionally been at Cape Canaveral in southern Florida. But the U.S. military has always insisted that launch sites also be located on the other side of the continent. That's why there's the Vandenberg Space Station complex in Southern California. Next, let's look at the Russians. They moved their launching pads to Baikonur in the middle of the Kazakh steppe. Why? Because there's nothing for miles around. That's important where launch sites are concerned, because in the event of an accident, like the rocket exploding or the lowest stage falling to Earth, no one would be injured. And that applies to all launch sites worldwide. The Russians established their other launching pad at Plesetsk in the north of the country. This enables polar orbits to be covered with ease. For their part, the Chinese have launch sites in China, the Japanese in Japan, and the Indians in India. And then there's Europe. The Europeans cannot, of course, launch their rockets from Europe. The continent is far too densely populated. So the French said, we've got this great colony in South America, French Guiana. There's nothing around the launch site but jungle and the sea. And that's the site Europe uses today.
Europe's spaceport is located in South America on a narrow coastal strip near the city of Kourou in French Guyana. Ariane rockets have been flying into space from their launch pad in the jungle ever since 1979. The spaceport was established back in 1964. Initially, the French tested their own rockets. Then the European Space Agency was founded and the Ariane program launched. Situated just 500 kilometers from the equator, Kourou is the ideal location for a journey into space.
One reason why there's no rocket launch site in Europe is because of the need to take off as close as possible to the equator. As you know, the Earth rotates in a west-east direction, and every point on our planet turns with it on a 24-hour cycle. So it has a certain orbital speed. This is greatest at the equator, where 40,000 kilometers have to be covered in 24 hours. When a satellite is launched, it's always launched towards the east because it's already given the speed of the location. So lifting off from the equator is a lot more energy efficient.
Since the mid-1990s, the pride of European spaceflight, the Ariane 5, has also been launched from Kourou. Despite a few setbacks at the start of the program and a failed maiden flight when the rocket exploded, Ariane 5 has long been the epitome of reliability. Every 8 weeks or so, an Ariane 5 lifts off from Kourou, taking satellites into space, often several satellites at once. A heavy goods transporter, it can convey an 11-ton payload into geostationary orbit and up to 20 tons into near-Earth orbit.
Ariane 5's maiden flight was in 1996. It marked the start of a truly huge European space project within which the companies developing the rocket have grown together. There's excellent exchange on a technical level, so everyone is very familiar with this product, and this leads to great reliability.
One decisive factor with regard to satellite launches is insurance, and the safer the rocket, the lower the insurance premiums.
Our customers love this reliability. If they plan to put a satellite in orbit, they want a reliable schedule and, of course, the assurance that their product, which costs millions, will arrive safely at its precise destination. Presently, that still distinguishes us considerably from the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Indians.
Where quality and reliability are concerned, the Ariane 5 still has no competition on the global launcher market. But in order to remain competitive in the future, the Europeans are building its successor.
Rocket development and access to space are, of course, also a strategic capability we have, because without rockets, we wouldn't be so successful commercially. In Europe, a lot of money is earned with satellites, which are also sold to other customers. And Ariane is extremely successful because it's very reliable. Ariane might not be the world's cheapest rocket, but when you include the insurance costs, your business model already looks a lot better. And Ariane really is an incredibly good workhorse.
The Ariane 6 program will bring the Ariane 5 era to a close. A completely new and more cost-effective development, Ariane 6, will ensure that Europe's door to space stays open in the future too.
So what about the space industry in Germany? Well, we have two major companies, OHB and Airbus. Based in Bremen, OHB builds our Galileo satellites, the navigation satellites, almost in series, while in Friedrichshafen, Airbus manufactures large scientific satellites practically by hand. So these two companies are world-class. The situation is probably most interesting in Bremen. Airbus is based there too, and they build not only Europe's contribution to the space station, the Columbus facility, which is our space laboratory there. Airbus also makes the ATV, or Automated Transfer Vehicle, which supplies the space station. We have flown there with it 5 times. And that really impressed the Americans. They said to the Europeans, we'd like to have that for our Orion. So at the moment, the ATV is being converted into a service module. And in the years ahead, we will fly to the moon with it.
The aim of the US Orion program is to enable NASA to again stage its own manned space flights. But it is not so much near-Earth orbit NASA has in mind as the exploration of deep space. And the Americans plan to return to the moon with the spaceship. Like the early Apollo capsules, Orion 2 has a modular structure. The supply module will dock onto the crew capsule, and it is this module which the Europeans are building for NASA. It will be responsible for the propulsion, the energy supply, and the life support system. The service module will also ensure that the astronauts are supplied with electricity, drinking water, and oxygen.
Through the European Service Module, for the first time, Europe is playing a critical role in the development of an American launch vehicle. Without the European Service Module, the system would not fly. This is a major step the Americans have taken, and we can only be grateful for it. Through the module, I believe, we're making an important contribution to the development of European spaceflight.
The European Service Module, the ESM, is being built at Airbus in Bremen. This is the first time that Europeans have been involved in the construction of a spaceship designed to fly people deep into space. The ESM is based on the Automated Space Vehicle, or ATV, which was also built in Germany. The ATV was used for supplying the space station. It could transport 7.5 tons of freight to the ISS and thus ensure a supply of food, water, oxygen, and fuel. The unmanned ATV calculated its course independently and docked onto the space station automatically. The technologies developed for this will also be incorporated into the ESM. Like the service module, the ATV was also part of an exchange deal between the ESA and NASA. In making the technology available, the Europeans are covering their share of the International Space Station's operating costs.
Let's talk about money. Exactly how much money does ESA have? As you see here, its typical budget totals 5.2 billion euros. And it's always said that manned spaceflight is the most expensive element. But look, that's not true. Accounting for 30%, the biggest share is taken up by Earth observation. In other words, all the satellites that are flying around up there recording all the data. Then come the launch vehicles, Ariane 5 and Ariane 6, with a share of 20%. Next, we have navigation. In other words, the manufacture and operation of the Galileo satellites. In fourth place is the scientific program, the scientific utilization of the data. And it's only in fifth place that we find manned spaceflight, which accounts for just 7% of total expenditure. As you can see, then all the rumors about manned spaceflight are not true. On the other hand, who are the biggest financial contributors to ESA? Top of the list is Germany, with around 800 million euros, followed by France with about 700 million. Of great importance here, however, is the gyro turn principle. Each country paying a certain sum into ESA receives just as much back for its own space industry.
Through participating in the ISS, Europe is also able to maintain its own astronaut corps. Consequently, Europeans are regular members of the space station's crew. However, Europe does not have the capacity to put its own astronauts in space.
We never intended to engage in manned spaceflight. It's all about satellites in diverse contexts and about research. That was always clear. In this respect, Europe has never competed with the Americans or the Chinese with regard to manned spaceflight.
Besides, the EU budget would never allow for manned spaceflight. Every 2 years, the ESA Council of Ministers decides on future projects and approves the financing.
Isn't all this expensive? Yes, spaceflight is expensive, partly because safety requirements have to be met. And above all, spaceflight has to be designed for an operational time frame of 15 to 20 years. You can't just send a mechanic up to service a satellite. But the issue is also always about strategic independence. How much is that worth? How much is it worth for Europe to launch European communication satellites into space and, therefore, perhaps determine the communication systems for Europe on its own? How much is that worth? And what does it have to do with freedom of the press or with freedom of speech? Such issues have to be weighed totally differently from household budgets.
The main cost factor is always the launch. Overcoming the Earth's gravitational force consumes most of the money in spaceflight. And it is here that visionary entrepreneurs see their chances in the market. Through mass production and uniform propulsion units, Elon Musk was able to reduce the cost of launching his rockets quite substantially. So far, though, SpaceX has not furnished proof that rocket reusability also has a positive effect. Clients who fly with a used rocket are at least given a discount. But without the support of government contracts, the private space companies in the United States, too, could not survive.
We must not assume that the money involved is now all private investment. SpaceX in particular has signed long-term contracts with NASA, excellent contracts, which provide security. And with this security, they can continue development. The thrusters they use were originally developed by NASA. I don't want to belittle it. I think it's fantastic. And these providers are putting pressure on us, not only through their cost structures, but also through their pricing policy. Take their manufacturing processes. The workshops at SpaceX, things look differently than what they do here. They can also take risks. If we did the same, we'd immediately face criticism. So it's important that there are these private investors and private firms. I must say, though, that Ariane the European satellite launch provider, is also a private company. It's wrong to regard Ariane as being a state company.
Just as Henry Ford once revolutionized car construction, with SpaceX, Elon Musk is setting new standards in US rocket technology. Because today, NASA, too, has to do some serious cost-cutting.
The Europeans also had to put in more and more money. So for them, too, it became an economic calculation. If I put X amount in, what do I get out of it? If the satellite is launched for me, can my industry earn from it? This economic calculation was looked at far more closely in Europe than in the United States, where things are seen a lot more idealistically.
In order to react more flexibly to the burgeoning satellite business, ESA included the Vega in its program. An Italian rocket development, in contrast to Ariane 5, which is a heavy-lift rocket, the Vega was designed for transporting smaller satellites, and the market for these satellites in particular is growing.
Just how expensive is a flight into space? That depends on whom you're flying with. Take Europe's Ariane 5. One launch costs 140 million euros. Now you could say, wow, that's really expensive. But it's not at all expensive when compared with the cost of the satellite that's being taken into orbit. In general, around 400 million euros. Nevertheless, the satellite operator has, of course, to keep an eye on every euro. That's why at present, SpaceX, with its Falcon 9 rocket, is the big favorite. A Falcon 9 launch costs only 60 million euros. Consequently, Europe decided to build a new rocket, Ariane 6, which will cost customers only 90 million for larger and 75 million for smaller satellites. That's still more expensive than SpaceX. But because Ariane 6 will be reliable, the insurance costs will be lower. SpaceX, however, has an even bigger bargaining chip. Where price is concerned, it can go even lower. Basically, SpaceX could demand only 40 million euros for a launch, and that really would be a problem for Ariane 6.
European companies can still hold their own, but spaceflight has become an extremely tough business with totally new competitors. It's not only SpaceX that is contesting the market. Today, China and India also have launch capacities to offer. What's more, increasing globalization is creating the need for greater flexibility and readiness to take risks.
There is more competition. And there are also private companies specifically striving to offer favorable prices. Anyone hoping to operate commercial spaceflight in the long term must not only provide safe and strategic access to space, but to do so at favorable prices.
The world's biggest operator of commercial satellites is Luxembourg company SES. It transmits over 6,500 TV channels and has at least 70 satellites in Earth orbit. The company is a major customer for rocket launches, one that is dependent on efficiency and reliability.
Under no circumstances can we rely exclusively on one launcher concept. For us, access to space means that we need several launch providers. It's not just a case of choosing one over another, but of finding exactly the right launcher in each case. Because we have at least a handful of launches every year. This means putting satellites in space to replace others and also to increase our fleet.
It became possible to transmit television pictures in the 1960s, but the real breakthrough for satellite transmission only came with the commercialization of the TV sector. When private television was given the green light in Germany in the mid-1980s, SES was ready and waiting with its Astro 1A satellites.
From a technical point of view, we bet on the right horse. Suddenly, we had a satellite over Europe which enabled various investors, like the Kirsch Group and RTL, to launch a television business model they believed in, but which no one in Europe had ever tried out. Historically, we were also very fortunate that this satellite began to transmit pictures in the year in which the Berlin Wall fell.
With the fall of the Iron Curtain and German reunification, the market for providers of satellite television exploded. But it was no longer just about television, but also about more general communication solutions and the global spread of the internet. When it comes to global mobile communications, satellites have no competition and are worth their weight in gold, offering applications no one even thought of 20 years ago.
The Luxembourg government not only benefited from the increased tax revenues and dividends from the one company, a microcosm of firms developed around it, which are active in the space sector. 1.8% of Luxembourg's net product comes from the space sector. This is the highest figure in the entire European Union. It alone shows that when you have the courage to tackle something new, you stand far more chance of it working and gaining an advantage over others.
The little Grand Duchy is thinking big. Exploiting raw materials in space is also on the agenda. It is not so much about platinum or gold as about obtaining rocket fuel and marketing it directly in space. Here, Luxembourg is thinking in timescales not of a few years but of several decades. The country has had to adapt time and again to changing economic conditions and as a result develop strategies and visions for the future.
We believe that in the medium to long range, materials will be mined in space. It's not a question of whether this will happen, but when. Luxembourg has always been a pioneer of new economic models. We have always had to reinvent ourselves. Companies from all over the world, research institutes from all over the world, they all want to come to us. They're all looking to Luxembourg. They would all like to become established in Luxembourg and work together with us. And that's precisely what we wanted to achieve.
Spaceflight is on the onset of a golden era, and near-Earth orbit in particular holds the promise of totally new business models for visionary entrepreneurs.
For many years now, we've been establishing startup centers within reach of research institutions. In doing so, we've created an environment in which young companies are offered support, and not only with regard to technology, an area in which most young entrepreneurs are proficient anyway. What they need to learn are things like management skills, issues of law, business models, where the market is, and where money can be made. And it is this support that young companies are given.
Technological progress no longer limits spaceflight to state industries. The development of young engineers and scientists is also given specific support from the private sector. The German Aerospace Center, for instance, offers teams of students the opportunity to design and also test their own rocket engines and satellites. More and more startup firms are emerging which see their field of business in space, either in the development of research rockets or in the design and construction of mini satellites.
Will such teams supersede the established spaceflight companies? No, they most certainly won't. They would have to attach top priority to cost. And how can you reduce your costs? Well, you just go into a do-it-yourself store and buy everything you need. Then you put it all together and hope that it works. Naturally, it doesn't. In a team like that, you've got enough time to tinker around until it works to a certain degree. But if a satellite like that were in space, as a rule, it wouldn't function at all, or maybe for just a year or so. Spaceflight companies take a totally different approach. They build a satellite which will have to function for up to 15 years right from the start, and that costs an enormous amount of money. It also calls for a lot of experience, so that's out of the question for young teams. However, if they have a really good idea, they can open a company and be successful.
Satellites are giving rise to ever more and novel applications. An uninterrupted stream of data is coming from space. In order to make this flood of information available without intermediate storage and in real time, ESA is planning a system of relay satellites. They will transmit the data from Earth observation satellites via laser light. It will be the creation of a data highway in space.
There's the idea of connecting the whole world to the internet, and that can only be achieved with satellites. It's an industry waiting to be exploited. We will position ourselves accordingly and come up with an appropriate product.
Information from space is of great economical but also ecological importance. Through the Copernicus program, Europe has established an independent infrastructure for Earth observation and the provision of services. From Earth orbit, Sentinel satellites focus on coasts, mountain ranges, glaciers and cities. They analyze the Earth's atmosphere, monitor the state of the ozone layer, and record every change in the climate. The Copernicus program has made Europe independent of international Earth observation missions.
We in Europe have a capability many of our international partners lack, and that's our ability to coordinate. Many big countries, like Russia and the United States, find it a bit hard to accept that smaller partners also want a say in matters. But that comes natural to us. For a long time now, we Europeans have managed to sit down with many partners and arrive at decisions which might not always be optimal, but are often reached in consensus. In the space business, that's simply a key ability.
The Galileo satellite navigation system promises to make Europe even more independent. It is the first system that won't be under military control. But the cosmic pioneers started 10 years late and with costs having soared enormously. A joint project between ESA and the EU Commission, Galileo holds the promise of autonomy, and it is seen not as a rival to the existing system, but as an addition to it. Ultra-modern instruments access the data from all navigation satellites, resulting in a vast increase in accuracy.
We can do a great deal ourselves. After all, in Galileo, we have developed our own navigation satellite program. We have our own X-ray satellites and many other smaller and larger satellites, news satellites. We do everything ourselves, and that, I think, is a great success story for Europeans as a whole, because everyone benefits.
Whether satellite operation or missions deep into the solar system, the Europeans have conquered their part of space.
What are the current issues with regard to the European space industry? Right at the top of the list is Ariane 6. How can we make it less expensive? ESA's answer is that we need to transfer the development and construction costs. And now, a newly established company, ASL, Airbus Safran Launchers, is taking over both. This way, it's hoped, the cost will drop. The question is, of course, whether reliability will also be guaranteed. There, only time will tell. The second big question involves the future of the space station. It will only be operated by the space nations until 2024. Then it will either be scrapped or handed over to new companies who will then put it to commercial use. Whether that will work remains to be seen. The third issue involves exploration of the universe. Away from low Earth orbit, away from the space station, and off again into the depths of the universe.
In March 2016, the ESA launched a mission to our neighbor planet Mars. The purpose of ExoMars: to examine whether life once existed on the red planet, or perhaps even still exists. However, Schiaparelli, the probe that was deployed, shattered on the Martian surface. It was a bitter blow, but not the end of the mission. The orbiter continues to gather data from the atmosphere. As part of a second mission, a robot will land on Mars and take core samples. Such programs cost a lot of money, and purely scientific missions do not always meet with the approval of European ministers in charge of space matters.
In a way, that's due to how society has developed. We always think about whether something is worth it. And exploration, delving into the unknown, suffers a bit from this approach. I think we rather underestimate the effect of these exploration issues, because they give people, each one of us, the feeling that we can dream and that dreams can become reality.
Europe has advanced into space. The European space industry has a broad spread. It sends astronauts into space, engages in research, manned and unmanned, develops rockets and satellites, and plays a leading role in Earth observation. But the space sector is subject to constant change, and man is a restless explorer. New goals have to be set.
What does the future hold for the space industry in Europe? Well, we have important projects in the fields of Earth observation, navigation, rockets, and research in space. They account for the lion's share of activities, about 75%, and that won't change, which is a good thing. Then there's the flagship project, manned spaceflight. And as long as the space station remains in orbit, there won't be any change there either. Certainly not until 2024. But after that, the golden age will dawn for us space freaks, because then it'll be off to the moon and then off to Mars.
Europe has established itself in space. The European Space Agency coordinates and controls European involvement, and in doing so, balances the interests of politics, science, and the economy. Europe is a successful conqueror and explorer in space, but ensuring that it remains so will take courage and vision.